I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. This is another presentation that the Virginia Project is putting on that's discussing the different types of theories that are emerging out of academia and have now permeated into our school systems, into our businesses, into really almost every facet of our life. But this topic here is going to discuss how this political ideology has taken root within our school systems. My name is Chris. I'm with the Virginia Project, and so I'll be kind of emceeing this event. With us tonight, we have Cathy Ruse, who has been gracious enough to meet with us and to put together this presentation. One thing that we want to stress is that this is a tough topic, right? This is not a topic where we're not anti-LGBTQ. That's not the purpose of this topic. The purpose of this is we are anti this political ideology that has entered into all of these systems, and especially our school systems, and how it's being pushed down to the children as young as kindergarten, and in some instances, when you see some private institutions as young as pre-K, is where I've seen a lot of this being pushed. So we want to make sure that parents are aware. We've discussed critical race theory in the past, so this is a continuation where we're going to be discussing gender and queer theory are involved with tonight's discussion. So again, this is not in any way, shape, or form anti-LGBTQ. Many of us have friends and family who we love, who are actually part of that community, and we're not in any way, shape, or form trying to demean or attack that community. But what we want to do is attack the ideology that is really pushing this. We don't what consenting adults do in their own home. That's up to them. But we do feel strongly that these sexualized, politicized topics should not be pushed as young as they are being pushed. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Cathy, and I will, Cathy, I'll change slides whenever you tell me to change. And
thank you.
And we'll chat here at the end. There'll be a room. If you have questions, please put them into the chat window down below, and we'll go through those once we wrap up. So over to you, Cathy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to the Virginia Project for inviting me and for hosting this. I'm a lawyer in private practice, and for many years I was working in public policy. And my own kids go to Catholic school. So I was not focused on what was happening in my school system here in Fairfax County, until I heard that the school board had voted 11-1 to let biological boys into the girls' bathrooms. So that got my attention. This was about 5 years ago. And so I decided I needed to look closer. And what I saw when I began going to board meetings, I saw a school board who could not care less about the concerns of families. I saw a school board that was arrogant and condescending, and who, quite frankly, felt free to play sex politics with other people's children. And they had been getting away with it for a long time. So I do believe that's about to change, and that's very good. So next slide. Where we really need to begin is with sex ed. And the first thing you need to know is that sex ed is not really about sex ed anymore. It's about politics and power, and gender ideology is at its center. This slide is SECUS, the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States. SECUS is the industry leader in sex ed. And SECUS recently rebranded itself. Its new logo is Sex Ed for Social Change. What does sex ed for social change mean? Well, SECUS tells us that it means sex ed is a vehicle for creating a generation of people who affirm each other's identities. Sex ed is a vehicle for racial justice. Sex ed provides an opportunity to shift the culture on LGBTQ equality, on white supremacy, on reproductive justice, which is a euphemism for abortion. Next slide. SEEK is the industry leader in sex education in America, as I say. And I say industry advisedly because sex ed is big business today with powerful international players. I had put together a slide that failed just before we started, but I show some of these powerful international players, such as the Human Rights Campaign, the Southern Poverty Law Center, a group called GLSEN, Gender Awareness, Planned Parenthood, and others. Altogether, these groups raise close to $1 billion a year and have nearly $1 billion in reserves. This is a lot of money. So the question is, why would so many wealthy international organizations pour so much of their time and energy and money into school lessons? It's because it's not really about sex ed, it's about politics and power. Next slide. Give me just one generation of youth and I will transform the whole world. Vladimir Lenin, these groups take that to heart. So I want to spend a few moments on sex ed generally, and then I'll focus the rest of my time on the promotion of transgenderism in sex ed and beyond. Next slide. The sex ed approach being pushed today by all of these powerful groups is called comprehensive sexuality education. Comprehensive sexuality education is an agenda-driven curriculum that sexualizes children, that promotes the concept of sexual rights for children, and radical sexual identities for children and teens. Sex positive and anti-shaming are its watchwords. Here's a prime example. You're looking at a screenshot of a video. This is a Planned Parenthood sex expert. And this video happened to be shown to 9th grade girls in Albemarle County, Virginia, without their parents' knowledge or consent. The video taught them penis pleasure, how to use sex toys, how to, all of these very graphic, all girls, basically sex techniques for your sex partners, little 9th graders. The parents found out, and the school did not apologize to the parents. Next slide. Planned Parenthood is the largest provider of sex education in the United States. It can be found in at least 31 states' education curricula. Its donors include the richest men in the world: Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, George Soros, the Rockefeller family. Next slide. Here's a lesson from its Get Real curriculum for 7th graders. Brittany's girlfriend wants to have oral sex with her. Her friends say that having oral sex will bring them closer together, but Brittany's mom thinks she should wait until she's older. Brittany's scared of hurting her girlfriend's feelings. What should she do? This is a Planned Parenthood lesson for 12-year-olds. Next slide. Have you heard of PrEP? A few years ago, Planned Parenthood was given a grant of nearly $1 million to promote PrEP. PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a drug to reduce the risk of acquiring HIV. It was created for men who have sex with multiple or anonymous male partners whose HIV status is unknown. I'll just say that again. PrEP is for men who have sex with multiple or anonymous male sex partners whose HIV status is unknown. It's a drug that must be taken every day, and even among the LGBT community, it is controversial. Next slide. Michael Weinstein, founder and director of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, called PrEP, quote, a party drug that will cause a public health catastrophe by triggering a dangerous increase in risky sex, end quote. And yet, consistent with comprehensive sexuality education, my school board, the Fairfax County School Board, voted recently to promote this drug to high school students every year in high school: 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. And incidentally, the Fairfax County School Board automatically enrolls every single student in its system into this sex ed without asking parents' permission first. Next slide. What about abstinence? Isn't sex ed supposed to include teaching abstinence? Well, yes, it is. and most states require that by law, as does Virginia. But that doesn't mean the people drafting or teaching it will be honest about it. In Fairfax County, I attended a meeting of the Sex Ed Drafting Committee, many meetings, but at one meeting, there was a member of the committee that tried to remove abstinence altogether. He is offended by the concept. And he had the votes to do it until another member remembered that it's required by state law, so they had to leave it in. But that may cause you to wonder, how does Fairfax County handle the issue of abstinence? Next slide. Well, here's the summary for the 8th grade abstinence lesson. This is what parents read. As you see, it says the lesson is about the benefits of abstaining from sex until marriage. But here's the actual script. Next slide. Students will be taken through a decision-making model where they will decide whether or not to be sexually abstinent. And note, then they're not deciding whether to save sex for marriage. The word marriage doesn't even appear anywhere in the lesson, not even once. They're deciding whether or not to save sex for a faithful monogamous relationship. In other words, for their next steady boyfriend or girlfriend. No parent believes that's abstinence. Parents in Fairfax are being deceived. Next slide. In place of abstinence, what leftists are pushing in public schools today is the concept of consent. Consent education is framed as a way for kids to resist committing or being a victim of sexual assault. Fine, we can all agree. But it goes way beyond that. And when its proponents are being honest, they admit it. Like, quote, consent means moving beyond refusal skills to teach young people how to ask for consent. And, quote, consent education respects young people's right to sexual agency and self-determination, end quote. This is comprehensive sexuality education, perfect example. Children have sexual rights and sexual agency. Now, even if parents are able to find out what is in sex ed lessons, despite the deceptive summaries, and opt their kids out, the propaganda is all around them. As author Mary Hassan says, today, kids are swimming in it in public schools. Next slide. The Southern Poverty Law Center, that notorious anti-Christian hate profiteer, pushes public schools to teach queer history with a glossy new campaign called Teaching Tolerance. This is a project to teach history teachers how to put a queer spin on nearly every major event in American history. And they have so much money that they can mail their slick best practices guide to every school principal in the nation, and they have, telling them how to make their prom trans inclusive and how to have a queer school culture. Next slide. The industry leaders push teachers and administrators to have school-wide celebrations like LGBTQ Equity Week. You can find this celebration recognized in public schools across the country every October. Parents are not asked permission about their children participating in these events, by and large. This here is a mural from a school in Illinois, and the school boasts that kindergartners get transgender story time, first graders make pride flags, and practice gender fluid pronouns. Next slide. In fact, there are over 15 different sex propaganda events that have been found on public school calendars. You can see there's a celebration for almost every month of the school year. National Coming Out Day, Transgender Awareness Week, and in June, an entire month dedicated to Pride. But not only that, in the library, Loudoun County is the perfect example. Moms and dads were horrified to learn, next slide, that the hashtag Big Gay Book Drive had brought hundreds of controversial titles to their schools. We could back up to, there we go, Georgia Peaches. Some of the books include lesbian themes like Georgia Peaches and Other Forbidden Fruit. Next slide. And the notorious book, Beyond Magenta, Transgender Teens Speak Out. in which a teen describes how he enjoyed performing a sex act on neighborhood boys when he was 6 years old. So far, none of these books has been removed. Next slide. But the real game changer, the thing that finally got my attention, is the total embrace of the radical anti-science proposition that biological sex is meaningless. The transgender movement wants to radically change society's understanding of the human person. Next slide. And as with any revolution, the softest target always is the children. Transgender ideology teaches children they can be born in the wrong body. That's a terrifying message, a horrifying message. And of course, it's a lie. The American College of Pediatricians rightly calls it psychological child abuse. Next slide. Public school systems like Fairfax County are scrubbing male and female from lessons on human sexuality and replacing it with fake science propaganda, like the term sex assigned at birth, teaching kids that their true sex can be different than their bodily sex. Next slide. Here's the crowd in Fairfax the night before the vote. The board voted in this radical anti-science language against overwhelming community opposition. Our side was in the green for nature and science. The other side is in pink. It was fascinating to see. First, the board probably felt it needed to solicit public comment. And so it received, on scrubbing male and female from the lessons, it received more comments submitted by individual commenters than ever recorded. And the comments were 9-1 against removing male and female from sex ed lessons. And yet the board did it anyway, which we suspected they were going to do. Another kind of fascinating thing that a whole presentation can be given on is the fact that the people with the green signs, one after another, got up and talked about the science, talked about biology, talked about the impossibility of changing your sex, which I'll talk about in a minute. The people in the pink signs had religious ministers, one after another, stand up. It was almost as if it was a religious doctrine that they were promoting versus against the science, who was the people representing science. More on that later, too. It was absolutely fascinating. Next slide. The truth is, of course, every child is born in exactly the right body. Every child is born in exactly the right body. That is what we believe. That is what we should proclaim every time we have the chance. Next quote. Our bodies declare our sex. They are designed to play one biological role in reproduction or the other. There are two biological roles to be played in sexual reproduction, one or the other. There are two sexes, two biological reproductive roles. The tiny fraction of people who suffer from what's known as disorders of sexual development, whom politicians like to call intersex, don't present a third sex. There are two reproductive roles, two sexes, and the people suffering from these disorders don't change that whatsoever. Next slide. In fact, it is medically and scientifically impossible to change your sex because every nucleated cell in your body, and we have 100 million of them, has a copy of your sex chromosomes. So that means that every internal organ in our body is either male or female, and that includes our brains. There's no such thing as a female brain in a male body, despite what the propagandists will tell you and will tell children in public schools. Next slide. Here's some propaganda from the anti-Christian human rights campaign, the largest, richest transgender lobby in the world. They want teachers to use psychological reconditioning techniques with the youngest children, aimed at causing them to question their sex. They use role-playing and games. They have children recite affirmation statements like, "I used to think this way, but now I know better." Next slide. Here's propaganda from the National Education Association, the largest teacher lobby in the nation. This poster is on many, many classroom walls. It says, "This is a safe and affirming space for transgender students and their allies. Bully free starts with me." The message to students is crystal clear. Either you affirm the lie that some children are born in the wrong body, or you're a bully. The National Education Association wants to paper every classroom and hallway with this poster. Next slide. A word about bathroom wars. It's not about bathrooms. It's about power and politics. Bathrooms are the tip of the spear. Activists use bathrooms to gain sympathy and they make the claim that people who are against biological males using the girls' bathroom want children to suffer and not be able to go to the bathroom all day. But of course, that's not the scenario in any school that I've looked into, because rather than address each case individually, which schools are willing to do, what these activists demand is system-wide changes. They say that complete system-wide overhaul is what is needed to make the environment safe. Next slide. These system-wide changes include school-wide affirmation of transgender identity, forced use of false pronouns, opening private spaces and sports teams to the opposite sex, and born in the wrong body lessons. Next slide. Forcing someone to use false pronouns or even to declare his own pronouns is a very serious matter. It is coerced speech, which can be a form of psychological manipulation, and children are particularly easy to manipulate. And in this case, in this context, they know that failure to conform carries the threat of social isolation, which is terrifying for any human, but particularly terrifying for children. But this manipulation is not limited to students. Next slide. Many of you may have heard about the Loudoun County teacher Tanner Cross, who is currently suspended for refusing to lie to students about biological sex. Before Tanner Cross, there was Peter Vlaming, and this is the picture of teacher Peter Vlaming, a French teacher in King William County, Virginia, who was outright fired for refusing to use a false pronoun. This is Mr. Vlaming's story. After Christmas break, one of his girl students returned identifying as a boy. Mr. Vlaming explained to his school that as a Christian, he believes God made humans male and female, and that a girl can't become a boy. He told the school he was willing to use the child's new masculine name, but that he could not use a false pronoun. Rather, he would need to avoid using pronouns altogether, because to use a false pronoun was to deny God's purposeful design. He was fired by unanimous vote of the school board. In 2019, he sued the board, and his case is still underway. He's seeking $1 million in damages. I think he should have gone for 10. Next slide. Each one of these sweeping changes demanded by the transgender pressure groups is fraught with problems. But the fundamental problem underlying all of them is that they ignore the fact that the vast majority of children who experience sex confusion will grow out of it. Historically, up to 98% of boys and up to 88% of girls who experience sex confusion grow out of it after naturally passing through puberty, according to the American Psychological Association. Next slide. When a child experiences sex confusion, the adults around him have a choice how to respond. The two schools of thought are watchful waiting or affirmation and transition. Watchful waiting acknowledges the reality of the child's current suffering, but remembers that the vast majority of children will grow out of this naturally. Trans activists call this approach bigoted. They demand immediate affirmation and transition. Affirmation requires that adults lie to children, telling them they really are the opposite sex. They really were born in the wrong body. Using opposite sex names and pronouns allowing or even encouraging female dress and makeup for boys, cropped hair, and breast binders for girls. This social transitioning is most often followed by hormonal transitioning, which requires monthly injections of puberty blockers for children as young as 10 years old, even younger, I've heard, 8. What follows is cross-sex hormones, given a few years later, which force the body to develop opposite sex characteristics like the growth of beards and a lower register of voice for females. Next slide. And the final step is surgical transition, now called by the Orwellian term surgical affirmation, in which healthy organs are cut off. All of this, every bit of it, is dangerous to children. Puberty blockers for sex transition are an off-label use. They've never been tested or approved for this use by the Food and Drug Administration. The changes forced by cross-sex hormones can be permanent. These drugs can make young people sterile, permanently stunt their growth, and cause bone fracture and memory loss. Think about the growth spurt that happens between the ages of 10 and, say, 15. My own children just went through enormous growth spurts during those ages. Children who are put on cross-sex hormones don't experience those growth spurts. They have stunted growth that they never can regain. Memory loss. These drugs can be given to adults to treat a form of cancer, but they are given very advisedly because they do affect your memory. How much more might they affect the memory of a growing, developing child? We don't know because we haven't studied this. There have been no tests done. What we are doing now are untested experiments on children. Breast binders can crack ribs. Phalloplasties, which is the name of surgery to strip skin from, say, the inside of an arm or the thigh of a girl and try to fashion a counterfeit penis. Phalloplasties can cause women to have to urinate through their anuses. Vaginoplasties, to create a counterfeit vagina, creates an open wound that is never allowed to heal. Next slide. So just consider what is happening here in public schools like Fairfax County. A child is cavalierly encouraged to explore alternative identities, to reject her own body. And when she tries a new identity, everyone around her lies to her. It tells her, yes, this is really the real you. What chance does that child have to experience the natural resolution, to ever accept her bodily sex? Aren't we trapping her in the wrong transgendered body? The night after Fairfax County scrubbed male and female from its curriculum, the trans pressure group GLSEN told the Washington Post that public schools in California and Northern Virginia are their laboratories for transgender policies. Next slide. What does that make the students? Yeah, it makes them the lab rats. I want to spend a moment on another group of people that's being manipulated and bullied, and that's the parents. Next slide. Parents are told they must affirm their children's sex confusion no matter what. No matter that the science tells us that they are most likely to grow out of it. Activists in and out of the medical field push parents to affirm, because that's what a good parent does if you love your child. They're pushed to put their kids on puberty blockers, to buy them time to explore their true identity. But this is a cruel trick. Next slide. A study out of Rehe University at Amsterdam, which followed gender dysphoric children who were socially affirmed as transgender and then put on puberty blockers, revealed something quite horrifying. Not one of the children ever grew out of their sex confusion. Remember that the APA, the American Psychological Association, says that children suffering from gender dysphoria, up to 98% of them, will grow out of it naturally. But this study reveals that when you socially affirm them as the opposite sex and put them on puberty blockers, What percent then resolves this sex confusion and accepts their bodily sex? 0%. 0%. Puberty blockers don't buy time to choose sex. Puberty blockers make the choice for children. Parents are being manipulated. Remember, they're suffering too. They're vulnerable too. And the bully's ultimate trump card is suicide. Parents are told they must do this or they will lose their child to suicide. Better to have a trans daughter than a dead son, they're told. But do they have evidence to support this claim? Next slide. The fact is, the only long-term follow-up study is from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. Researchers looked at the suicide rate of post-op trans-identified people, and what they found was shocking. The suicide rate remained at nearly 20 times higher than the average. In other words, these poor people did everything the trans ideologues would have them do, even to the point of surgically mutilating their bodies, and still they're killing themselves. Next slide. Sex change does not prevent suicide. Last year, the Democrats in Richmond passed a law mandating transgender policies in every school beginning this fall. In addition to forcing everyone to use false pronouns, the model regulations include school personnel affirming a child's transgender identity at school in secret without telling that child's parents, and school personnel supporting the safety of transgender students when their families are not affirming by reporting families to the Child Protective Services. Next slide. I excerpted part of the model policy, and I'll just read it because it's maybe hard to read on your device. School staff should be prepared to support the safety and welfare of transgender students when their families are not affirming. Whenever school personnel suspect that a student is at risk of abuse or neglect by their parents due to their transgender identity, they should report those concerns to Child Protective Services immediately. Wow, what could go wrong there? Would it be neglect if a mother refused at home to call her daughter a son or to use her daughter's chosen male name? Would it be abuse if a father refuses to buy a breast binder for his daughter? What is abuse or neglect, and who decides? Something similar to this was tried in Madison, Wisconsin last year. When parents found out, they went to court and they got a ruling preventing the school district from enforcing any policy which allows or requires school staff to conceal information or answer untruthfully when a parent asks for information about their child at school, including the name and pronouns being used for their child at school. So there is good precedent out there if school districts in Virginia really try to impose this on families and teachers. But this avenue will be cut off if the so-called Equality Act passes in the Senate. The Equality Act, if it becomes law, some experts believe that teachers will be able to rely on it to outright lie to parents about their children. The Equality Act must not become law. It would turn the entire country into a transgender laboratory. Next slide. If trans activists win, it's women and girls who stand to lose the most. If men are allowed to identify as women, then woman has no meaning. That's why radical feminists are fighting the transgender movement. They call it the erasure of women, and they're absolutely right. If we're not allowed to call someone a pregnant woman, if we have to say pregnant person, we're literally erasing women. Biden's new multi-trillion-dollar budget calls us birthing persons, but it's more than that. The trans movement demands that biological males have access to all girls' private spaces, not just bathrooms, but dressing rooms and showers and hotel rooms on overnight school trips. Next slide. In the public school setting, in any setting, frankly. If girls or women are anxious about sharing these intimate spaces with biological males, if they feel intimidated or uncomfortable, they have no recourse. To object is to be labeled a bigot. What about girls who are sexual assault survivors? This is a population that far exceeds the population of boys who want to identify as girls. These were their safe spaces, now being taken away in the name of inclusion and compassion. Will these trans-inclusive policies be exploited by male predators? Of course they will be, and they already have been. The news reports are horrific. Next slide. Of course, who's going to win the sports trophies if taller, stronger males are allowed to compete as females? Who's going to get the scholarships? Transgender crusaders don't care about what's fair. This is Rachel McKinnon. He steals gold medals from in women's cycling championships. He calls himself a human rights crusader and calls his critics transphobic bigots. Next slide. This is Hannah Mounsey, a 6'3", 220-pound giant who plays women's rugby and breaks women's legs in the process. Next slide. Transgenderism is a fraud. It wraps itself in fake science and scorns all true science that doesn't further its political goals. Biology is bigotry, they say. It speaks of safe environments and then forces open private spaces of women and girls to biological males, including predators, and exposes them to injury on the sports field. It calls for non-discrimination and then discriminates against women and girls by robbing them of sports victories, scholarships, and careers. It calls itself progressive, but acts like a retrogressive tyrant, especially when it comes to the freedom of speech. And worst of all, it preaches tolerance and acceptance and then tells kids to reject their own bodies, even to the point of self-mutilation. In conclusion, we have great compassion for people who feel alienated from their bodies. Their suffering is real, but they are surrounded by people who are lying to them, and we have to be lifelines to the truth. If we allow ourselves to be bullied into using false pronouns or even bullied into announcing our own pronouns, we're not being polite. We are declaring our agreement with the whole agenda. We are agreeing that some people are born in the wrong body, that a male body can have a female brain, that sex is assigned, not revealed, that a plastic surgeon can change your sex, that woman is a meaningless word, that sports should be canceled for half the human race, that children should be injected with growth-stunting, sterilizing hormones, that healthy young bodies should be cut up and made infertile. Next slide. But most of us don't believe these things. And our words and actions must be consistent with our beliefs. Otherwise, it is we who are living a lie. The argument of my husband's new book, Under Siege, No Finer Time to Be a Faithful Catholic, is that we are actually living under a new established church. And the media, the entertainment industry, academia, all major corporations, not to mention our local school boards, have been conscripted to hunt and punish heretics of this new church, heretics who do not bend the knee. Next slide. But we must resist, because what we believe is something truly affirming, that every child is born in exactly the right body, created male and female by God in his own image out of great love for us. To deny this truth is to deny God himself, and that we cannot and we will not ever do. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you, Cathy. So if you have questions, please place them into the chat and we'll tackle those. I have a couple of questions, Cathy, that I want to throw out at you. So I guess I'll start with, you and I were chatting over email earlier this week. There was an article that I shared with you about Drag Queen Storybook Hour.
Yeah.
And there was something interesting that came out of that article. And I was wondering if you could, maybe share what one of the commenters in that article who themselves as a drag queen was saying with this group. And maybe you could describe a little bit more of what is Drag Queen Story Hour or Storybook Hour.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Drag Queen Story Hour is a movement that is designed to break down children's defenses and when you look at their own words, this movement's words, they are encouraging small children. Usually it's done in libraries, often usually public libraries. And they are performed. These are drag performers that perform for little children to encourage them to explore different identities. It is when most people hear about this, they actually don't believe it's a real thing. They absolutely don't believe it's a real thing, and it's not surprising that they're so shocked. But it is a real thing, and we had our first in this area, Fairfax County. We had our first Drag Queen Story Hour just a couple of weeks ago. And I have to just tell you, the one thing that was kind of funny that came out of this is that one of the drag queens brought a purse that was in the shape of a dog. And he was trying to make the point that he was really a woman and that this dog was really a cat, even though it looks like a dog. And there was a little boy in the audience that kept saying, "It's a dog." And the drag queen was like, no, it's a cat. It's a dog. It's a dog. It's like, and somebody said, stop messing with the kid, So Drag Queen Story Hour is part of the transgender movement. They are kind of like the shock troops. They're kind of getting in there. There is one drag queen whose name is Kitty Demure, who has come out and said, okay, drag shows are not appropriate for kids. They're highly sexualized, that parents should not bring their children to drag shows in any location, even in the library. And that basically, according to Kitty Demure, you're a bad parent if you bring your kid to a drag show. One other thing that should be mentioned is that Drag Queen Story Hour in particular, present garish views of women and femininity. Feminists that I know don't like Drag Queen Story Hour because it makes a mockery of what it means to be a woman and female. So even if you get past the transgender message, even if you're just thinking about what little girls watching a Drag Queen Story Hour are learning about what it means to be big girls and women, these are not what you want your little girls to learn. Putting aside even before you get to the transgender part. So it was a terrific piece that was written in the Fairfax Times, and I commend them for presenting a fair piece with quotes from all sides. And I encourage your viewers to look up the story.
Yeah, I found it to be a very fair piece as well, which is uncommon in these days. But I do appreciate, again, what adults do in their own time. We're not going to comment on that. You're adults. You have agency. You can take responsibility for what you're doing. But it's crazy for what they're pushing down to our youngest children. And so
Chris,
I
forgot to mention. Can I just say, we paid for this Drag Queen Story Hour, incidentally, Fairfax taxpayers. We paid stipends to each of the drag queens. We pay for the library personnel. We pay for the facilities. This was government-sponsored drag show for toddlers. So just wanted to add.
Exactly. A good segue from there. So a couple of comments in the chat. Yes, we are going to be providing this information. We will make that available. It'll be posted to the Virginia Project website, so people will be able to see it. This is, I listened to Cathy speak about a month and a half ago, and I was like, we need to share her message because it's so powerful. So it will be available. There's a segue in there, especially femininity, womanhood. There is a term that's being used now by the Biden administration. It was in all their budget documents that were just submitted to Congress, called birthing person, right? Could you elaborate a little bit more about what they're meaning with birthing person?
Yeah, they're erasing women. The Biden administration is erasing women. They're erasing the word pregnant woman. They are making the word woman an offensive word, which is offensive to women. It is, I have to say, I am a conservative. I have never worked so closely as I do today with radical feminists and lesbians who can see the threat from the transgender movement, especially to women and girls. Absolutely, especially to women. I mean, boys too, and young men, obviously. I mean, children are being lied to, no matter their sex. But in particular, girls, because this erasure of women is quite severe. We have some countries that are being pushed to erase Mother's Day because Mother's Day is offensive. When the Biden administration was challenged about this language, it was comical watching them tap dance. But if you notice, they didn't back down. They are all in for this. They want to erase women, 100%. So they did not back down.
Yeah, it's really mind numbing to watch all this happening, to see countries tell doctors that they need to refer to breastfeeding as chest feeding.
Yep.
It's so infuriating. So that's why, again, what we're trying to get the message out. There's a question in there about model legislation. The Virginia Project doesn't have anything at this time. We are actually working on creating some model legislation. I know of a number of people who are working on that within the state to try to help remove some of these things from the school system. So that's something that we are trying to work with people that we know in the House of Delegates or running for the House of Delegates. So to answer that question, there's a question in there about pedophilia. Is that their ultimate end goal? I myself, I'll let you comment on that in a second, Cathy. What I've uncovered in my 5+ years of research is that there's actually a movement out there called minor attracted people. They've changed pedophile to minor attracted persons or minor attracted people, MAPs. There are actually TED Talks that are done promoting the acceptance of minor attracted people. Do you have anything else that you've uncovered on that?
Well, I'll just say the whole consent movement, consent education that I mentioned, why are we teaching underage kids how to consent to sex? I mean, that's like the biggest red flag that anybody should see. Any parent, no school should be involved in this. But yet, I mean, I've sat through many sex ed drafting committees at Fairfax County, and they don't see a problem with that. But children should not be consenting to activities that are illegal for them, just without even, no matter what it is. But yet we are going to teach consent education and pretend like it's to prevent kids from being involved in sexual assault. But I read you just a couple of quotes, and you just have to dig a little bit deeper, and what you see is really troubling.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% there. There are times where I actually have to step away from social media because it's so disturbing. Some of what we're seeing. I mean, there's an attack on J.K. Rowling happening again right now.
Exactly.
Because she's standing up for womanhood.
Yep.
And they're trying to cancel J.K. Rowling. And I mean, if you can cancel a billionaire like Rowling, but she's fighting. So I do appreciate it. And I do appreciate that I'm watching lesbians and rad femmes fight this, and they've been fighting successfully in Europe. So we need to see the same thing happen here in the States. This is a serious problem about the erasure of womanhood. Mm-hmm. I'll make one comment and then I'll ask, I think, one question in closing. So we're getting close to the 8 o'clock hour here. One thing that most people don't realize, and I don't think that a lot of people realize, is how this information is laundered through the academy, right? So they're always citing studies or research, but they never really show you what those research or those studies are. And so I highly recommend that folks on this call look up. It's called the Grievance Studies Project. You can look it up on YouTube to watch a quick 5-minute video on it. But what it essentially, what they proved is that if you have the right ideological framework, you can use critical theories and you can write papers and conduct research, and they'll be rubber stamped through the academy. And then this allows people in places of power, like on a school board or like the Biden administration, to reach back and point and say, no, there were studies done on this, right? Meanwhile, those studies are small end samples of 1 or 2 people talking in an echo chamber. And I think one of the biggest studies that the Grievance Project proved to me was when they literally rewrote Mein Kampf. But they wrote it from a radical feminist perspective, where they removed the word Jews and Jewishness and whatnot. So they rewrote Hitler, and they removed Jews, and they just replaced it with white males. And it was an approved paper, and it was actually recognized as stellar academic achievement. Right. So that's how they're laundering it. And many people don't understand that the research that's coming out of the academy is just so fraudulent. Like you keep pointing out that it's a fraud. And so people, I think once you start understanding that you really can't trust the research that's coming out to support this stuff, you really understand the nature of what we're dealing with here. I guess the final question that I would have for you, and I apologize if you covered it. I don't think you mentioned it, but can you speak a little bit to rapid onset gender dysphoria? And what's happened with the researcher there and whatnot?
Yeah, and I actually I had a slide that fell off that had resources, which is really important. And among them are resources for parents who have children who have experienced rapid onset gender dysphoria. This is what rapid onset gender dysphoria is teenagers who suddenly believe they are in the wrong body. It's a rapid onset. And what researchers have learned, or what we are beginning to learn, is how caught up, how it is really a social contagion, sort of like anorexia from 30 years ago. The stories, the stories are horrific about how friend groups, say in high school or college, will start, all of a sudden the whole friend group will say, of girls will say, no. One will say, no, I'm really a boy. And then the next one, and then the next one. And then all of a sudden, all of them will declare themselves a boy and start walking down that path. And sometimes it'll be cases where they had a favorite coach who influenced them, or social media for sure. So the idea is, you've got a daughter, she all of a sudden announces that she's a boy. So she wants you to affirm her. Well, some parents say, well, maybe we should go see a specialist, go see a doctor and find out, why you are feeling this way. And another horrific thing that's coming out is that when these girls are taken to counselors, nothing is looked into, not any of their psychological conditions, not any trauma in their lives, not any traumatic experiences, which might be impacting their psychology, but rather the counselors are immediately affirming their born in the wrong body status, and very quickly giving them prescriptions for hormones. So it is a medical scandal what's happening with especially teenage girls today. And so what I will do is send you the slide with all of the resources, not only for rapid onset gender dysphoria, but others, so that maybe you could make that available if anybody's interested as well. And I really regret that wasn't part of my presentation. Like I said, it fell off. But kids are being pressured. They're being pressured by their peers. They're being pressured by their public schools. They're being pressured by the culture, and the parents need to do everything they can to protect their kids today. This is not a game, because there are sites online where kids can go to get around the parents' involvement, where they can get prescriptions. It's serious business.
Yeah. So is there anything that you didn't cover that you want to bring up here?
I don't, no, not that I can think of, other than, again, those avenues for help, which I'll send you that long list.
Yeah, I appreciate that. If there are any questions that the audience has that was not answered, go ahead, send us an email over at the info@virginiaproject.com, and, we can work on getting answers for you that way. And, Cathy, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us tonight. I appreciate you taking some time out, and I appreciate you taking time to help, make people more aware of what's going on out there. So thank you very much for your time.
You're most welcome. I'm really grateful to have done it.
All right. Thanks all. So we're going to close the presentation. Again, this will be made online. If there's anybody out there that wants to help donate to help out the cause, we appreciate that. The host posted something into the chat window here, and we will. You'll see us on Twitter. We're very active. So, and on Facebook. So thanks all.
Thanks.
All right. Closing out here.